This movie shows the future that will be if we don't change course. But it is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature over which we have no control. They are the work of our own hands. They're small machines, about the size of the chairs that each of us has been sitting in this evening. We know how to take them apart. We have just, until this point, lacked, as a global community, the political will to do that. And that is what needs to change. And that is the job that we all have before us. How do we bring about that change? As I said, I think the key to this is education. I think that the vast majority of people in the world today are profoundly ill-informed about this danger. They don't know that it exists. The film mentioned that there is scant attention in the media to the danger of nuclear war. That was in 1965. Well, that's where we are today as well. There have been times that have been different, and we need to know about those as well. In the early 1980s, there was a tremendously energetic movement around the world, in the United States, in Europe, in the Soviet Union, demanding an end to the Cold War arms race, because people then did know about the danger of nuclear war. If you asked people then, what are the great problems facing the world, preventing nuclear war was number one and number two on everybody's list. Today, if you pose that question in a survey, nuclear weapons don't even register on most people's lists. But the important thing for us to remember is that when people did understand in the 1980s the danger that nuclear weapons posed, millions of them took action. And that action led to a profound change in nuclear weapons policy. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States, pledging to make it possible for us to, and I'm quoting him, fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. And we built weapons to do just that. And we came within moments, on multiple occasions, of fighting that nuclear war and enduring the horror that this film has shown to us tonight. But within 4 short years, all that changed. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev said together that nuclear war could never be won, it must never be fought. They ended the Cold War arms race, and they began the process of dismantling the vast arsenals that existed at that time. And so we know that when we educate the public, when we all take action, we can bring about profound, fundamental change in nuclear policy. The challenge before us today is to do again what we have done once already. When the Cold War ended, people stopped paying attention to this problem. And that inattention to this existential threat is in many ways the greatest danger of all. And so it is our job, those of us who now know about the danger that we face, to make sure that everyone else does as well. And there are some very hopeful signs. Around the world, many countries have come together to adopt, sign, and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a treaty that was negotiated at the insistence of countries that do not have nuclear weapons, who understand the threat posed by the arsenals of those who do, not just to the people of those countries that are armed with nuclear weapons, but to the entire world. And these countries came together and said they do not want their people to be held hostage any longer to the insane nuclear policies of the 9 countries that have them. 122 nations voted on July 7th, 2017 to adopt this treaty. 86 have signed it so far, and 51 have ratified the treaty. 55 have ratified the treaty, so that it is now entered into force. None of the nuclear armed states are among that list of countries which have taken this step. And so, for those of us who live here in the United States, one of the 2 great nuclear superpowers, our task is clear. We need to bring about a situation where our government understands the enormity of the danger it faces, the enormity of the danger it is posing to the rest of the world, and fundamentally changes its nuclear policy. To that end, many of us here in the United States have launched a campaign called Back from the Brink, a call to prevent nuclear war. It is modeled on the Freeze campaign of the early 1980s in that it provides a platform, a prescription of what U.S. nuclear policy should be as opposed to what it is. And it calls on the United States to begin now negotiations with the other 8 nuclear-armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate their remaining nuclear weapons so that they are all in compliance with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and can sign and ratify that treaty. The Back from the Brink platform also calls on the United States to take some intermediate steps right now, unilaterally, to lower the danger of an inadvertent nuclear war and to give momentum to the movement to eliminate all nuclear weapons. It calls on the United States to adopt a no first use policy, to promise it will never use nuclear weapons first. It calls on the United States to end the situation where the President of the United States can launch nuclear war on his or her sole authority without anyone else being able to weigh in. It calls on the United States to take our nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert so they can't be launched by accident in a moment of poor judgment as a result of a cyber attack. And it calls on the United States to forego the plans to spend $1.7 to $2 trillion over the next 3 decades to enhance every single element of our nuclear arsenal. To date, 350 organizations around the country, including Physicians for Social Responsibility, Veterans for Peace, MassPeaceAction, and many others, have endorsed this call. It's also been endorsed by more than 50 municipalities, cities and towns across the country, and by 6 state legislative bodies. And right at this moment, we are asking local elected officials all around the country to sign on to a letter to President Biden endorsing this course of action as well. There are brochures on the table in the back of the room that explain this campaign and that give you instructions on how you can contact your local elected officials and ask them to sign on to this letter, which has been signed at this point by 180 local officials around the country, including more than 30 here in Massachusetts. But there are lots more we need to reach with this message. So, all of us, I think, are pretty overwhelmed by this experience we've been through tonight. It is natural, after seeing something like this, to want to forget about it. This has been very unpleasant, and the way we deal with this is to put it out of mind. But we can't do that. Because if we put this out of mind, if we don't think about nuclear war and talk to people about nuclear war and take action to prevent nuclear war, then we're going to have a nuclear war. And that's the reality that we're in, as horrible and unpleasant as it is to think about that. There are 2 great existential threats before humanity today: the climate crisis and the prospect of nuclear war, and we need to address both of them. And we need to address them both with equal urgency because they're both imminent threats to the survival of our civilization and to the survival of hundreds of millions, billions of people. But again, we have the ability to forestall these disasters. It is not written in the stars that we will die in a nuclear war. And I think we need to take great hope from the successes we've had in the past. And we also need to approach this whole problem, I think, with the spirit of what it is that we can do. You know, every one of us wants to do something good with his or her life. Those of us living today have been given the opportunity to save the world, which is the best thing anyone can ever do. And so while this is a terrible responsibility that we bear, it is also an extraordinary opportunity to give the greatest gift we can to our children, our grandchildren, and those who will come after us. To give them the opportunity, as one of the people in the movie said, just to grow up, to enjoy this beautiful world, and to not have to be in fear that it will all be taken away from them. So, do the things you need to do to protect yourself psychologically from the pain that we're all feeling right now. But don't forget what we've all learned tonight by watching this movie. None of us is expected to solve this problem on our own. But each one of us has to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And if we all do that, we're going to succeed. Just like we stopped the Cold War arms race in the 80s, we can end the nuclear weapons era once and for all and get rid of these weapons. And that is the challenge before us, and one which I hope all of us will take up. So let me stop talking and take any questions people might have, and more importantly, comments that people might have about things that we can do to bring about the fundamental change in nuclear policy that we need to bring about. I have bright lights in my eyes and I can't see anybody's hands if they're up. So if people want to speak, please just stand up and talk. Well, we're fortunate in that several of our representatives in Congress have been real champions of efforts to deal with the nuclear threat. Senator Markey and Senator Warren have both sponsored legislation to adopt a first use policy. They've sponsored legislation to cut military spending on nuclear weapons. Congressman McGovern, my congressman in the western part of the state, has also played a very important role in this effort. But I think even they need more prodding, because there's a lot of issues out there that are competing for people's attention. And it's hard to focus on this one, which is kind of abstract. Hunger is taking place every day in our cities. The drug crisis is taking place every day. The COVID epidemic is taking place every day. This is something which isn't, thank God, taking place every day. And so it's kind of hard for people to focus on it. So even the very proactive members of our congressional delegation who have addressed this issue need our support, and they need our encouragement to do more. And the rest of the congressional delegation we need to speak to. We need to get all of them to be voting against this insane plan to spend nearly $2 trillion on more nuclear weapons. And we need to get them to use their position as members of Congress to put pressure on the administration to change nuclear policy. The US government is currently undergoing what's called the Nuclear Posture Review. Each administration, each presidential administration conducts one of these. And this Nuclear Posture Review is just beginning this month. It will lead to a new nuclear policy statement probably in January or February of next year that will set US policy for the coming administration, possibly the next 8 years. If that statement reflects the policies of the past, we are in terrible trouble. What we need to have is a nuclear posture statement emerge from these deliberations that understands that nuclear weapons do not protect us, that they are the greatest threat to our security and they need to be eliminated. And that's possible. I'm not optimistic, but it's possible. This is a fundamental review of policy that's being undertaken at this time, and we need to get our state delegation in Congress and our local elected officials to raise their voices and tell the administration we want that fundamental change in nuclear policy. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. Also important to remember that the production and storage of nuclear weapons and testing is killing people. It has been since the beginning of the nuclear age. And Congressman Markey did a lot of research about this.
Speak up.
Congressman Markey did a lot of research about the effects of the production of nuclear weapons on killing people who were on test sites, people in power production facilities.
It's a very important.
State, Texas, Tennessee, Outrage, we place it all very high efforts against these things. To bring that to remember people, remind people about that this isn't just an abstract thing. Really, time.
it's a very important point. There are victims today of the ongoing nuclear enterprise, not just people who were killed at Hiroshima, but people who were exposed to radiation through the testing, through the manufacture of weapons, through the mining, and so on. I think we need to be clear, though, that as horrible as those health effects have been, and as indefensible as the experiences those people were subjected to, they do not begin to approach the scope of the danger that we are now facing. But they are an important reminder of the ongoing danger, and of course there are the health issues that these people face that need to be addressed now as well.
On a practical level, how would you encourage people, voters particularly, say, and I'll use an example, I live in Rhode Island, Senator Jack Reed is considered nobility amongst folks among the left and the progressive movement because of his stances that are very progressive on every issue except war. How do we separate the necessity to continually challenge Senator Jack Reed, who is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, a graduate of West Point, a clear member of the military-industrial, perhaps one of the most powerful men in the world? How do we get the average, not the people who are here, but the average progressive voter to understand that his stance on nuclear war and war in general outweighs whatever positives he has in pearl clutching for other issues?
Well, again, I think I don't mean to be a broken record. I think it's a question of education. I think we need to try to reach out to as many people in the progressive community and the general community in Rhode Island and educate them about the positions that Senator Reed has taken on nuclear weapons and about the need to have a very different nuclear policy. It is difficult, especially when you have someone who has been progressive on other issues. I think part of the problem is we need to have people understand the primacy of these two issues, climate change and preventing nuclear war. All the other things that we're doing today, and they're very, very important. 1,000 years from now, no one's going to care if we had a good healthcare system, if we had insurance for everyone, if there were unemployment benefits. All they're going to care about is, did we prevent climate crisis and did we prevent nuclear war? And we need to help people understand that, not saying that we shouldn't work on these other important issues, but that these two issues are in a category that is quite different, a category by themselves. They are the only two existential threats we face. And if we don't deal with them, nothing else that we do is going to matter, because no one's going to be here to enjoy the benefits of the other work that we've done. I don't know if that's an
No,
answer.
that's spot on. It's the challenge is actually, as you say, doing it, but voices like yours goad us on, spur us on to having that deep dive. And American politics is short attention span theater, right? I mean, how do we get folks to concentrate? And a movie like this, how do we get that mass appeal to what everyone in this room clearly believes?
This movie, by the way, is easily available. We hope to do some additional in-theater screenings, especially hopefully as the COVID pandemic ultimately passes and we're able to do more in live events. But it's also available online, and it's something that people can show to other audiences that they have access to. Their faith communities, their Rotary clubs, their other civic groups, whatever. And I think this is one of the most powerful tools that we have, because it does, it personalizes it. This is not just sort of a flash and statistics. These are these people who we see with our eyes who, suffering. What is going to happen to all of us if this ever happens? So it's enormously powerful, and we should take advantage of it, make good use of it.
Yeah, I thought I'll be the first woman to speak at this point. I just want to say that I think rather than say these other matters that are taking all of our attention now, we don't have to contrast. What we can do is actually bring it in to the dialogue. So all the money we're not spending on the COVID situation and on what has become very apparently a great disparity, a great inequity nuclear disaster and climate change? Yes, we do. And if we were to put more of our monies towards things that really make people's lives better, we have to take money away from what is being spent on destruction. And that we do want to have, this would be in the benefit for everybody in the world, because we all benefit more from a peaceful and seeing what our common needs are as a whole globe. So I think there's a way, how do we bring these dialogues together versus we gotta focus in on the major crises. I agree with you, but how we do it is key.
Thank you for that comment, and I think what you said is absolutely true. You know, as long as we're spending these enormous sums of money on nuclear weapons and on the military in general, those resources are not available to deal with the other problems that we need to deal with as a society. I would just simply add one note of caution, though, which is it is possible to substantially cut the military budget and still have an enormous nuclear arsenal. The nuclear expenditure, it's obscene, but it's about $50 billion a year out of a total Pentagon budget of over $700 billion. Unless we make the specific case that nuclear weapons need to be eliminated and win that political argument, then just cutting the military budget is not necessarily going to get us what we need to get to with regards to nuclear weapons. You know, the reason I talk about the climate crisis too, right now, the great nuclear powers, US, Russia, China, the major players, they're all engaged in this really insane competition to see who's going to be, you know, the hegemon, who's going to end up on top of the world. And they're engaged in this competition as the whole world is falling apart around them, which they don't seem to understand. We need to have a real paradigm shift in the way that the great powers, all countries, behave, so that they understand that it doesn't matter who's on top, if what they're on top of is an ash heap. They need to understand that they can no longer afford to spend their time and their energy and their resources competing with each other. They have to work together to deal with things like the COVID epidemic, like the climate crisis. And I don't think we pose this to them as this is a moral thing. You know, this is the way you ought to be because it's the moral thing to do. It certainly is that. But this is the way they have to act because this is the way they have to act if they're going to survive. It's a very pragmatic, practical message that we're trying to bring to these people in leadership. And that, in some ways, is I think, perhaps the key to our success. If we can get them to understand the enormity of the danger that they face with business as usual, perhaps we can get them to do all the right things that they need to do. Sorry, Dan, please.
Do you see the Biden administration heading to disarm nuclear weapons, or do you think he's on the course of building more?
It's hard to know. I think at the moment, the signals that we've gotten are that, you know, he's put forward a budget that includes spending on new nuclear weapons. There are people in his administration who oppose this, who believe that we need to eliminate nuclear weapons. There are clearly people in the administration who are all in on let's have a big nuclear arsenal. And that's, you know, the background for this nuclear posture review that's going on. It's not completely clear which school of thought is going to win that internal debate. I think the odds are not great for our side winning. The momentum seems to be towards a continuation of the basic nuclear policy of the last 70 years, which is to rely on a nuclear arsenal. President Biden himself has said some things to indicate that is not his thinking, but it's not totally clear what he thinks, and it's also, most importantly, not clear how much political effort he's going to invest in this, which goes to the question that we were just talking about a minute ago. No administration that has had the understanding that we should get rid of nuclear weapons has been willing to devote the political capital towards bringing about that policy change. Obama flirted with the idea, got a lot of pushback, and just decided essentially that it wasn't that important, that he needed to use this political capital to do other things. And again, that's part of our job, to get the leadership to understand, yes, it is that important. This is, along with climate change, the most important issue that you have to deal with. Again, I'm not saying not to deal with the other issues, but you've got to deal with these two, and nothing else ultimately will matter.
As I understand it, Russia has the most, and the United States is second of having the most nuclear weapons. Is that true?
That's right, and they're very similar numbers. It's about 6,000 in each arsenal. The Russians have a few more, and it obviously doesn't make any difference at that number. We could have a third a number, we could have a tenth a number, but still have enough to destroy Russia.
It's disgraceful.
Sorry?
I said it's disgraceful.
It is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering about how we can deal with people's denial. I mean, it's like denial is the least effective defense mechanism, but that seems to be the major thing. I mean, it's like today in the press there's hardly anything about Hiroshima. I mean, FDR did, but otherwise. So it's like it's just like it's just hard even to get it in the public discourse, just to get people even to recognize it, which is understandable. It's horrible, but we don't get that into the public discourse.
Well, I think that's a really fundamental and correct point that you're making. Denial is the problem. People are not thinking about this. They're pretending the problem doesn't exist. They're pretending it went away. I think the problem we face is maybe even worse than it was in the early years of the nuclear weapons era, because the world collectively breathed such a sigh of relief when the Cold War ended. You know, we dodged the bullet. We weren't going to have the nuclear war we'd all feared, that we kind of just can't bring ourselves to the realization that we didn't dodge the bullet. It's still flying around, ricocheting off the walls. And we've just been lucky that we haven't been hit so far. I don't know what the answer to this question is. It's something I think about all the time. We achieved something quite remarkable in the 1980s in terms of the level of understanding that we were able to create in the general public. And we have not been able to recreate that understanding in recent years. I don't know what we did different then. I'm not sure what was different. And I think that's something for all of us to think hard about. I mean, part of what we did then was just to keep doing the work, to keep showing movies like this, giving lectures, talking, organizing. And at a certain point, we sort of reached this critical mass is the only really good term for this. We reached a critical mass, and the movement really took off. To me, the simple-minded response to this problem is to just keep doing the work, to keep talking to people, and to hope that we again reach that critical mass where people find themselves talking about this all the time. One of the problems is, we all come to an event like this tonight, we see this movie, we leave terribly concerned and determined to do something about it, and then, as you were just suggesting, we don't hear about this for weeks. In the 80s, you'd leave here and the next day there'd be something in the newspapers and there'd be something on the news, and you'd be constantly reminded of why it was that what you had just learned was so important. Now, when I'm talking to audiences, not like this one, which has selected itself to come to an event like this, but say I'm talking to a college class, the reaction I get is these people really, the students, they get it. They understand what I've said, but then day after day goes by and they don't hear about it again. And they don't want to think about this because it's horrible to think about, and they're able to convince themselves, well, that guy sounded convincing when he spoke to us, but he must be wrong, because if there were really this big a danger, we'd be hearing about it all the time. So somehow or other, we have to make people hear about it all the time. We have to keep talking about it. Simple things. Writing letters to the editor, it's really valuable. It's not in the press usually. If people read the letter to the editor page, and especially in their local newspapers, if people start reading letters to the editor all the time to talk about nuclear war, it starts clicking. But we need a lot of good creative thought on how we do this. Yes?
Yeah, first off, thank you for participating in this, and thank you for everybody that was involved in putting this on. It's such a wonderful event, and such a wonderful space. Thank you very much. I guess my question to you would be, where do we draw the line between production and development/research? So that's to say, every country in the world would agree, all right, let's destroy all the weapons, which I think everybody would be in favor of. Can you then also been researching how to develop and produce a weapon in 1 minute. So like, where do you draw that line? And also developing the things that go into the weapons, the ancillary benefits that come with that.
So
In your opinion?
I don't think we can ban the research. Or this is a genie that can't get put in the bottle. You go on the internet and figure out very simple directions on how you build a nuclear weapon. The place where we can intervene is with the supply of fissile material, because plutonium and highly enriched uranium are very difficult to produce. There are limited stockpiles on the planet which need to be brought under international control, and they need to be, we don't have a good way of storing this stuff in the long term, but the intermediate steps that we do have at hand need to be implemented so that these materials are rendered into a form where they cannot be assembled into nuclear warheads. And then we need to completely ban the future production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And if we do that, that breaks the chain. Without the fissile material, even if you know how to build a nuclear weapon, you can't do it. And that's where we have our leverage. And this is where we can interrupt this process.
Yeah, but the fissile material also has other things that it's used for, correct? Like energy, or I'm speaking from point of ignorance on this, but like I imagine like it has benefits related to power too, correct? So like, where do you draw the line between like that and weapons and being able to convert into weapons?
Well, I think this is one of the arguments why we shouldn't have nuclear power, because it is inextricably linked to the process of building nuclear weapons. And any country that has a nuclear power industry has the ability to purify enriched uranium and build nuclear weapons. That's one of the major arguments against nuclear power. There are others in terms of how dangerous it is. And that's something we're going to have to deal with as well, because we are going to have to stop the production of fissile material. We don't need nuclear power. It is not the solution to the climate crisis. We need to focus on true renewables like wind and solar and so on. And I think we need to forego nuclear energy for just the reason that you're suggesting. Because if we have a nuclear energy industry, it is going to be impossible to safeguard against the development of new nuclear weapons in the future. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for fielding these wonderful questions. I've been thinking that this amazing group of younger folks have pulled together and made a treaty. Why can't other intelligent people merge together, like your organization, like NAPA, and pull our brains and deal with the media that is not exposing this stuff regularly, and deal with schools that are not bringing this up over and over and showing films like this, and help us deal with what we need to do to educate and influence our politicians. Because all of that is what's really needed. A concerted plan like the building of this treaty. It took 7 years, you know that. You were part of the steering committee, and I'm so impressed, as you already know, that you were. What about building this other? It means somebody's got to sacrifice a lot of years just for this. And many other things that I can't even think of right now, but it's pulling together in a different way than what we're doing isolated in this state and that state, and heck, right here in Boston. I also want to remind people who I miss at the front desk, these little cranes that are pins are to remind you to talk with people about this issue. Let them stimulate a conversation about, what are you wearing that for? What's that all about? I wear them through this month, and I'm going to be wearing them through January, because that's when the treaty is going to be talked about again at this time in Vienna to update it. Thank you.
Thank you. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was brought about by a partnership between a number of far-sighted, visionary government leaders around the world and an extraordinary mobilization of civil society in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which was, in fact, led by some older people, but a lot of young people who played a critical role in this whole campaign to get the treaty adopted and the ongoing effort to get more countries to ratify the treaty. Here in the United States, we have hoped that the Back from the Brink campaign would be something like the ICANN campaign. It was modeled with that very much in mind, and as a vehicle that could bring people together. My involvement in the nuclear weapons issue has very much flowed from my work as a physician, and the medical community as a whole has at times explicitly stated that this is part of our mission, that nuclear weapons are the greatest public health threat in the world, and that as physicians and other health professionals who are committed to protecting public health, we need to address this issue. The film, watching that as a physician, the thing that struck me, of course, was the utter futility of the efforts to attend to the victims. And this has been a central part of our message. You know, what motivated many of us initially to become involved was the idea back in the 60s and then especially in the early 80s that somehow or other nuclear war was survivable and that it would be bad, but we'd patch everything back together again. And the medical community was assumed to play a large role in that patching back together. We were going to take care of the victims. And as this movie made very clear, and as we understood at that time, that isn't possible. No significant medical response can be mounted, even to the explosion of a single nuclear weapon in one city, let alone the widespread use of nuclear weapons across an entire country. And the statistic that was given, I think they calculated in this case that each physician would have 350 patients, all of whom were severely injured. That is the reality. That's what it would be like. And there's nothing that even the most dedicated, hardworking doctor, nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, respiratory therapist could do, really. Would be putting Band-Aids on lethal injuries. And so part of the message that we have felt it important to bring is just that. Don't look to us to sort of fix the world after nuclear war because we can't do it. And in medicine, if you have an illness that cannot be treated, cannot be cured, then you have to prevent it. And that's the bottom line here. We cannot afford to have a nuclear war. We must at all costs prevent this. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, for putting themselves through this experience. I've thought a lot today about my dear friend Setsuko Thurlow, who is one of the bravest and most generous people I've ever met. She's an Hibakusha woman who accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICANN in 2017. She was 13 on the day of the attack in 1945, and she has spent her entire life since then talking about this. She makes herself relive the experience she went through that day over and over and over again to bring an understanding to people all around the world of what's at stake here, and to try to make sure that nobody else has to go through what she went through that day. We've had sort of a very, very minor version of that tonight, having to witness the horror in this film. And we all have to have the same kind of courage and generosity of spirit and determination going forward to share this information with everybody that we can. And again, if we do this, we can succeed. We can get rid of these weapons. This does not have to happen. Our children and our grandchildren can have the life that they deserve. Thanks again very much for coming out tonight.